the Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important webinar about the historic Johnson versus Grants Pass Supreme Court case about homelessness. We are going to give folks 2 or 3 minutes to settle in, and then we're going to get started with our all-star panel. But you are in the right place. Take a second, grab some lunch, grab some coffee, grab some water, and we're going to get started in about 2 minutes, or as soon as the deluge of folks joining trickles off, but you are in the right place. Hey, Tracy.
Hey, Jesse, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Hi, Tracy.
Hi, Helen. So good to see you.
Amazing to see you.
Again, thanks so much to everyone for joining us. This is an event between the National Homelessness Law Center and the New Republic called Beyond Grants Pass, how a Supreme Court ruling could reshape homelessness across America. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. We have hundreds of people joining, which is very exciting, and we want to make sure everyone's here before we get going. All right, let's get started. We have a jam-packed hour of expert wisdom to get through, so I don't want to keep us waiting any bit longer. We're going to do some quick introductions, and as we're doing that, I'd love for folks to pop in the chat where they are coming from and their name if you want to share. I think it's really important that we continue to build community, even virtually, to strengthen our connections and strengthen our movement. My name is Jesse Rabinowitz. I'm the Campaign and Communications Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, and we're so grateful to the New Republic for hosting this webinar with us. This was inspired by a phenomenal article written by Tracy called The New Sundown Towns, which we will talk more about, but we are excited to take the momentum from that piece and from this case and turn that into more power for our movement to solve homelessness. Before we dive in, I'm going to ask our panelists to quickly introduce themselves, and then we will dive into the show. I'll start with Will.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and thank you to the New Republic for having me. My name is Will Knight. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Decriminalization Director for the National Homelessness Law Center. So what that means is I'm our primary litigator. I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona.
Helen, do you want to go next?
Yes. I'm Helen Cruz. I live in Grants Pass, Oregon, and I have been here 40 years, and I pretty much am on the ground here in Grants Pass, and we're all anticipating the judgment of the ruling.
Thanks, Helen. Matt?
Reporter for the New Republic here in Washington, D.C. I cover law and the courts. My pronouns are he, him.
Thanks. Donald?
Good morning, and I want to thank the New Republic for inviting me as well. I'm Donald Whitehead, Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless in Washington, D.C.
Thanks. And Tracy?
Hi, I'm Tracy. I'm a writer and a tenant organizer. I helped start the LA Tenant Union, and now I am on rent strike in New York. Yeah, oh, and my pronouns, if you want to get on my good side, are they, them.
Thanks, Tracy. So glad that everyone's here. So I'm just going to do a very, very quick bird's eye view of the case to make sure that everyone's on the same page. This case came out of a small town in Oregon called Grants Pass. There are about 40,000 people there, but Grants Pass is a good stand-in for many cities across the country. The population there doubled over the past 20 years, but the supply of housing didn't, which means that there is not enough housing. there's only a 1% vacancy rate. So even people who have lots of money to burn can't find housing. And people who don't have a lot of money to burn are forced to sleep outside because Grants Pass has no shelter and no housing that people can afford. Grants Pass has a gospel rescue mission that is not a shelter, that requires folks to provide free labor to the church, that requires you to abstain from drugs, sex, and alcohol, requires you to go to Christian church services twice a day. So if you don't want to do those things, or you can't meet those work requirements because you're old or sick, you can't stay there at all. And you also have to pay $100 a month. So there's no housing, there's no shelter, and that means that people sleep outside. Instead of responding to people sleeping outside with things that work, like housing and services, Grants Pass decided to give people like Helen $295 tickets, which, when unpaid, resulted in thousands of dollars of fines and potential jail time. That makes homelessness worse. But the people in Grants Pass knew this wasn't fair. They sued the city and they won. The court said it is a violation against the Constitution's protections against cruel and unusual punishment to punish people for sleeping outside when they have nowhere else to go. Unfortunately, mayors, governors, right-wing billionaires really, really want to throw homeless folks in jail and saw this as their opportunity to get the Supreme Court to hear a case that would make it easier to use fines and jails to punish people experiencing homelessness. So on April 22nd, the Supreme Court heard the oral arguments in the Johnson v. Grants Pass case. This is the most important Supreme Court case about homelessness in 40 years, and as we'll talk about today, will really either make it easier for cities to make homelessness worse by throwing folks in jail, or will encourage cities to focus on the true solutions to homelessness, like housing and supportive services. We are expecting a ruling any day now, probably not today. We're expecting this coming Thursday or anytime next week. Please visit our website, johnsonvgrantspass.com, for our up-to-date social media toolkits, messaging, videos, and statements about the court, whatever the court's going to do. You can also check out the 42 friend of the court briefs that were submitted on behalf of 1,100 signatories. There's great content. I will put the link to our chat, but we are so grateful to all of you today because we went into this case with two goals. One was to win the case, and the attorneys left it all on the field. And I see that Ed Johnson from the Oregon Legal Center, who has been working on this case from the beginning, is on a call. So I want to give a huge shout out to Ed for all of his and his team's hard work. The lawyers have done their job. They have argued the case to the best of their ability, and I think did an incredible job, and we were surprised at how well the oral arguments went. But we know that the Supreme Court was never going to solve homelessness. So we are excited to work with you all to use this moment in time to build the power we need, not only to reject harmful policies like the extremist ones they were doing in Grants Pass that give homeless people tickets and throw them in jail, but to actually advocate and push for the proven solutions to homelessness. So come what may, we are going to be working together to push the president, to push Congress, and to push state houses to do their jobs and make sure that every American, regardless of race or income or gender, has access to the safe, decent, stable housing that they need. I am really excited to turn it over to Matt Ford, a legal reporter from the New Republic, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what happened in the courtroom on April 22nd.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with the other panelists, and of course, great to meet all the guests as well. What happened in this case was that the justices took a long time on it, and I think that's one of the things that really stands out to me about this. The transcripts for the oral argument go on for about 180 pages. They spoke for multiple hours about this. The justices seem to recognize the importance of the issue, as well as the long-lasting ramifications that their ruling will have on how states and municipalities deal with homelessness. There were some positives in terms of how the justice approached this case. Many of them seem keenly aware of the impact that homelessness can have on a community and can have on the people who experience it. They seemed reluctant to completely carve out any sort of constitutional remedy for those involved. But at the same time, we saw that the Supreme Court's usual conservatism, in this case, small c conservatism, is sort of shifting them away from letting the federal courts take an active role in addressing this issue. We saw this most keenly with Justice Gorsuch, who was not really all that eager for federal courts to decide important questions of homelessness policy in his view. But at the same time, he didn't want to render a ruling, or he didn't seem interested in rendering a ruling that left people experiencing homelessness with no recourse. He was one of the justices who most emphatically emphasized the possibility of a necessity defense, which is something that the two sides went back and forth about on how Oregon law applies to that. But the most important takeaway there for me is that the court, through Gorsuch, through Kavanaugh, through Barrett, may not be interested in rendering all doors closed here. Even if they do not accept the Eighth Amendment argument as construed here, they don't seem interested in foreclosing any possibility of judicial relief. And what that would mean is a person who gets cited or who gets arrested would be able to go to court and raise a necessity defense along lines of, look, Your Honor, I had nowhere else to go. The shelters were full. That would be an affirmative defense that they could raise and in court to help them. Now, of course, that presents its own issues. It still requires people experiencing homelessness to go through the criminal justice system. It still requires arrests. It still requires fines. But it's on a spectrum of approaches. It sets it apart from the more Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas realm of things, which thought that there's nothing for the court here to do except to say that the Eighth Amendment has no role in this. The court's been of two minds on the Eighth Amendment recently, especially with all the turnover during the Trump years. On one hand, the justices have taken a much more hard line on certain cruel and unusual punishment questions. They have, especially on the death penalty and matters like that, but they've also shown some willingness to expand areas where it comes to excessive fines and when it comes to applying other aspects more equitably to certain groups. And so I think that while the oral arguments were not a tremendous success, there were signs of hope in how the court approached this that may avoid a complete and total defeat for people experiencing homelessness in Grants Pass.
Thanks so much, Matt. So Matt just gave us a great overview of what happened in the court. Outside the court, there was a historic rally with about 700 people from across the country, and I'm excited to turn it over to Donald Whitehead to talk about what happened outside, what was happening around the country, and how this ties into the broader movement to fight for the rights of people experiencing homelessness and fight for a world where everyone has the housing they need to thrive.
Jesse, thank you very much. Donald Whitehead again, National Coalition for the Homeless. We're actually the oldest advocacy group that works on homeless issues directly with people experiencing homelessness. This issue was an issue of extreme importance, one of the most important issues that we've seen probably in the last 40 years and maybe ever. So a number of groups got together to ensure that there was a response and people organized around the country, and we had most of our national advocacy groups come together through the National Coalition of Housing Justice. Those groups met for a number of weeks to really plan a response. So we did, as Jesse said, we brought in buses from several cities, including Philadelphia and Baltimore, and we also had people come in from New York and Nashville and Cincinnati, among others, for a total of, I think, more than 700, but that's the official number we got. And it was, the energy was palpable. You had groups when they were marching to the site. It was just amazing to see the energy that groups like VOCA New York and other groups brought to hearing them chant from when the buses got dropped off. You have to drop off about a block away. And then we had an amazing group of speakers. Jesse Rabinovich did a wonderful job of emceeing. We had people from across the country and many of our national organizations, also people with lived experience speaking. We did a actual direct action event there where we laid on the ground. Although the justices couldn't hear us inside, maybe they could. There was a few loud chants that maybe
They
got
could,
through as
they heard us.
so what it really symbolized, and in addition to that event, which I think was one of the first events in a few decades that we really organized together, did some direct action. I think it symbolized to people back in the communities that were able to see the event, that people care about them, that people have their back, and people are willing to leave their comfort zone to make sure that their issues are brought to the forefront. Excuse me. Sometimes people think we just do work here in DC with our elected officials, and a lot of the hard work happens on the ground. But in this case, almost every organization that works on this issue was represented, and it really helped people understand that people do have their back, and we're willing to put our bodies on the line to make sure that this egregious issue is actually finally addressed in a way that's not just talking about it, but acting on it. And there were 33 events across the country. RAP, the Western Regional Advocacy Project, organized about 13 of those, and cities all across the country were organizing with us in collaboration on that day. And to me, it signals the idea that there is a community that is invested in this event. There was a lot of publicity that was generated, and I think it's the start. It wasn't the end of something. I think it was the beginning of an organized movement to address criminalization, people being jailed, fined, handcuffed, and arrested in America. That should not be happening. And I think what we left that event with was the idea for people living on the street that were able to witness it through videos, through the newspaper, through whatever vehicle they were able to do it. They got to hear that we have their back, and they know now that they are not in this fight alone. And we at the national level are not going to stand for continued criminalization of homelessness.
Thank you so much, Donald. I am proud to turn it over to my colleague, Will Knight, who's going to discuss the universe of what could happen next.
Thank you for that, Jesse. And, I really do think that we're on the cusp of a sea change in how we do this litigation because of this case, but it's a little hard to predict. Matt gave us a great rundown of how a lot of the different justices had different philosophies. And so there's a real possibility here that we'll end up with something called a plurality, which is where there is not a clear majority. There aren't 5 justices joining in the ultimate opinion of the court, but maybe there are 5 if it's 3 talking about necessity defense and another 2 talking about this other thing. There might be 5 concurring in the ultimate decision, and so whether to reverse or affirm the Ninth Circuit. Because of all that, makes it a little difficult, but there are a few things that I can say with certainty. So first, like you kind of started us with, Jesse, this is not going to make our unsheltered homelessness problem any better, no matter what the Supreme Court decides. Even if there is a complete victory here, the Martin and Grants Pass principles were never solutions to homelessness. These were mechanisms, emergency backstops for when cities like Grants Pass were making things worse, much worse, by criminalizing homelessness, which is, as we all know, an incredibly expensive way to make homelessness worse. That's the principle of these cases, was to stop arresting homeless people for existing. And whether the court affirms that or reverses that, it's not going to improve the homelessness epidemic that we're facing in this country, because housing solves homelessness, and that's it, bottom line. Second, and this is better news, it does appear that the worst case scenarios are off the table. I can say that with some degree of confidence. We were really concerned in the beginning that the court was going to revisit historical interpretations of the punishments clause to say that there is no proportionality element in what's cruel and unusual under the 8th Amendment anymore. Or potentially to overturn a really famous case called Robinson, which stands for the principle that it is cruel and unusual to punish someone for being of a certain status. In that particular case, being an addict, being addicted to whether it be narcotics or alcohol or whatever, to punish someone not for possessing or anything like that having to do with contraband and the conduct of consuming it, but just being an addict. That's what that case stood for. And there was a lot of concern that they were going to overturn that and overturn centuries of precedent that held that the Eighth Amendment does have inherent in it a proportionality requirement. I don't think that's the case anymore. One, we heard Justice Amy Coney Barrett say straight up during oral argument that they're not going to overturn Robinson, which is fantastic because that would have been catastrophic. And we also saw, based on the context of the discussion, that it looks like they're not abandoning longstanding principles of proportionality. And third, this is the other important thing to remember. No matter what happens, we're going to continue to be able to use the courts as the great equalizers that they were meant to be until our policymakers find their backbone to do the right thing and protect access to affordable housing. That means no matter what happens, we'll still have access to statutory claims, like, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act and state law corollaries like it that protect people with disabilities. For religious freedom acts that we have in most states and at the federal government to protect against compulsory religious practice and things like you were describing happening in the Gospel Rescue Mission. If the case is affirmed, whether it's plurality or not, that will obviously be great because it's going to skip us right past having to develop a consensus in the circuit courts on this, since all of the precedent that existed before was just out of the Ninth Circuit. In fact, we're working on a case with some folks in the Third Circuit right now that's pending in front of that court that will probably be the first published opinion outside of the Ninth Circuit interpreting the Eighth Amendment in this context. And if the Supreme Court affirms, then that won't be necessary. It won't be necessary to establish that in any other circuit because it'll be the law of the land. But if it's reversed, we're still not dead in the water. Thankfully, because of the incredible movement of amici who showed up in this case, because of the way we were able to communicate the importance of this issue to the court, it looks like the court appreciates that the question isn't so much about whether homeless people have a right to exist, but where that principle might be found in the Constitution and how that principle is enforced mechanically. So we still may have, like Matt was discussing, the ability to challenge this on procedural limits like the necessity defense. And in places where that's not practically accessible, we may be able to litigate procedural due process claims for denial of access to that necessity defense, where people don't have access to public defenders, for example. The substantive limits might sound under the 5th and 14th Amendments instead of the 8th Amendment. You can't punish people for non-culpable conduct, for things that aren't criminal and don't warrant punishment in the first place. And then there are a bunch of other foundational constitutional provisions that are really, really important to how our federal government, our federalist system is structured. For example, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, even the Commerce Clause, which says states can't, there's a principle called the Dormant Commerce Clause specifically, because the power to regulate commerce is exclusively in the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. States cannot burden or unduly interfere with interstate commerce. So when you have states trying to banish their citizens, like Grants Pass was doing, and like many other states are doing, and send them to other parts of the country, that is a huge burden on interstate commerce and also potentially on the right to travel. So while this is a really important case, and it's difficult to predict exactly how things are going to look going forward, I am really, really confident, based on the context of the arguments, that we're going to have a lot of options available.
Thank you so much, Will. I'm now going to turn it over to Tracy, who wrote what I think is the best piece of reporting about the Supreme Court case, an article called "The New Sundown Towns." Will and Donald mentioned about how this is a legal battle, how this is an organizing battle, but this is also a narrative, public perception, and communications battle. So Tracy, I'm curious to hear from you what you have learned and what you think the movement needs to take away from this moment in time to continue to fight not only against things that make homelessness worse, like jails and fines, but for actual solutions to homelessness, like housing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for your support. And I feel like, Yeah, I mean, what you're asking about, right, is like the war of position that we're in the context of waging. And I feel like, you know, like as a writer and an organizer, like this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And in this moment where we're living through a backlash against homelessness, that backlash is taking narrative forms. And I guess I would, it seems really important to talk about two of them, right? Like one is this logic of deterrence, this idea that you, like by criminalizing people, by punishing people, you can stop them from being homeless, that you can punish someone and they will be encouraged to make a different kind of choice, and thus stop being homeless. Like that's one set of discourses. And then the other, right, is, which is related, is this idea that I track, that like I also track in this piece, which is about like individual behaviors and individual crises. So like through this logic of we can treat our way out, we can treat an individual who might be suffering from mental health or has like or uses drugs, and that we can treat that behavior and then the person will stop being homeless. So like if you'll notice, right, like both of what these discourses are about are really like taking what is a systemic problem and foisting it on the individual who is having this experience, right? And so, you know, this kind of individuation of social problems that we're seeing is like, and I think that it's really important to note that we're seeing this not only like there is a vast like Republican project supporting these ideas, but also this is like, oh, this is part of a new liberal playbook. And we have to name that and like expose the way that our liberal governances are collaborating to prop up these narratives of the right and to continue criminalizing our people who live outside. So I think, right, just to like make it clear, right, there is no peniological purpose to punishing someone for being homeless, because you can't punish a person because it takes four full-time minimum wage jobs to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment. So like this kind of myth, like the way that this is framed, to support criminal justice as a solution to what is effectively a systemic social problem. And then similarly, right, that this idea of, that I track in the piece, this idea of treatment, that personal accountability and individual behavior can be addressed, and somehow someone will miraculously get a job with a better income, a job with a union, that there will be affordable housing in the place that they live, right? None of these things are possible. And I think for me, right, like I really want to like, I think people often talk about like in this, like, I think people who often talk about this idea of like humanizing people who live outside, and it's like, I have no interest in humanizing human beings, right? Like that to me, that discourse, that language is, I think that moves us away from like what the task at hand is, right? Which is to name how people are products of the places that they live. And so I think that, like, you know, in the piece that I wrote, like the mayor and people who live outside, and you know, the volunteer who like decided to build a shelter, that these, like, all of these characters, right, are like a product of the system that we're living in. And it's really important to me, right? And then I'll finish up. But like this idea that like cities themselves will point to, you know, this idea of cleanliness, right? This logic of like, there's trash, there's drug use, right? Like people talk about encampments, right? And not the people who live in them, and not the economic conditions that create the need for people to live outside. And they don't see, right? Like, you don't see the fact that the cities locked the trash cans up as punishment for people to not be able to use them. You don't see that without having a place to rest, like using drugs is actually like, if you don't have a good place to rest, like you might want to use drugs in order to like get a decent night's sleep. And so I think that like, you know, for me, it's really about expanding the frame to the systemic problem, which is that we have completely abandoned a strategy. We've completely abandoned the social welfare to the private market. And what the private market has done is raised rents to the extent that people can't afford them and they live outside. And so until, you know, our politicians have any kind of political imagination to address the problem at like where the problem lies, right? Where the problem lies is not with individuals, it's with our economic, political, and social systems. And so, yeah, I'll just end there and say that like, I really appreciate the support of the piece. And I really hope that that was really, yeah, that was really my hope, is that we used this moment in the courts to actually take a look at some of these really harmful discourses that we're stuck in, to show the similarities between the liberal cities who claim to be above it but aren't, and the like Republican, you know, like we can't slough off Grants Pass and say, oh, that's a conservative place. That has nothing to do with us, right? I think it has everything to do with us. And it's like really important for us to like think through what that means.
Thank you, Tracy. And now I'm thrilled to turn it over to Helen Cruz, who lives in Grants Pass, who spoke at our rally in front of the Supreme Court and is going to share what criminalization currently looks like in Grants Pass, as well as other parts of her story that she wants to share. Helen, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you guys for having me. I've been in here at Grants Pass for about 40 years now, and recently, you know, everything that's taken place has basically opened a lot of people's eyes, especially mine. Ever since the hearing started and it went to the Supreme Court, things have only gotten worse here. The law enforcement here is they're seemingly a lot harder than they were. They were pretty harsh before, but now ticket after ticket still. I'm still actively, you know, involved in the homeless community out there, and there's a high sense of uncertainty, you know, of what's going on right now. You know, just anticipating the wait for the ruling in the hearing. And you know, there's a lot of people are on edge, you know, and there has been a couple of changes to where, you know, the City Council of Grants Pass has actually, you know, made some type of effort since the Supreme Court, you know, hearing and everything, but not too much. And one of the things that I've been digging into and is we were allotted like $9.37 million from the ARPA, American Rescue Plan, for housing and public health. And I'm wondering why we still have only 1% housing rate, you know, and where that money went to. You know, it's a big concern for me. And I brought it up to the public here, you know, and honestly, I just do believe that everybody over here in Grants Pass has blinders on. They don't want homeless here. They have a very harsh attitude towards them. Still people, you know, you got people out there that are still abusing the homeless, that are part of the community. They call themselves Park Watch, you know, and they're vulgar, and they're more of a vigilante than the homeless are, you know. And what people don't seem to understand is they don't want to be in the parks. We don't want to be in the parks. We want a place to live, you know, and we all have that right to have a place to live. And the fact that Grants Pass, you know, has pretty much shunned everybody over here, is to me, I think, very inhumane. They're taking a lot of rights away that everybody else, you know, has as individuals. When it comes to you know, the park exclusions and stuff like that, they're still handing them out. And when they go in front of city council, you know, they know they're not gonna win. You know, they know it's pretty much like they're losing hope over here. You know, and I just wish that, you know, things would be a lot different as far as, I wish it wouldn't be so political. You know, I wish it would be more towards, you know, we are all human, you know, and have a little bit more compassion, you know, and sometimes, you know, when I get these people, they come to me and they're like, Helen this and Helen that, and I'm like, I don't have the answers, you know, and they have a lot of hope, but then again, they're losing it quite quickly. You know, and it very much frustrating for me to see these people. I mean, there's probably been like, we have a hot summer coming up, and I don't see much of any shelter as far as people being out in the heat. You can over here, the Housing Authority and one of the nonprofits, you know, the city council is not going to give them funding for people that are out there in the heat, you know, and just the same as in the wintertime. And you know, they're turning sprinklers on people's tents. They're you know, like Tracy said, locking down the garbage cans. You can't throw things away, but then they want to go in front of city council, and the community does, and say, hey, you know, we're mad these people are in the parks. Well, if they would just, you know, figure out what they need to figure out for these people, for all of us to be able to have a place to be. You know, I may live in the church right now, but here's the thing. This is not my permanent home. You know, and I still work and I still have a job, but there's still no way for me to afford any type of housing here. None. You know, and when it's very frustrating, you know, and I'm out there and I'm helping people move their tents. They still have to move every 3 days. You know, and you move every 3 days, and it takes at least 1 day to set up. You know, and a lot of the elderly around here, there's been a couple that have passed away, you know, and they were my friends. You know, and like I said, I just wish it wasn't so political. I just wish there, you know, there would be a way for everybody to be able to find a solution somehow.
Thank you so much, Helen, and I think that is the great segue into some questions. I think I'll ask this to everyone. We know that throwing folks in jail or giving them tickets doesn't get them housing, and it only makes homelessness worse. From y'all's vantage point, I'd love to hear what the actual solutions are. Like, if Helen, if you had a magic wand or you were the mayor of Grants Pass, what would you be doing to solve homelessness? And then I'd love to hear from other folks as well.
I would actually be bringing the community together more, you know, and focusing on the fact that we're all human, you know, and there's plenty of, you know, the homeless, they have skills too. They can build, you know, they have life skills. You know, if the community all came together and we could bridge the gap between the community and the homeless and let them understand, be more humane towards the homeless, then, you know, if we could bridge that gap, I think we would be able to come to a huge advantage when it came to solving the homeless problem here in Grants Pass. You know, instead of people just individualizing the fact that we're homeless and they're not. You know, if there was a way to bridge that gap right there, I think things would be amazing.
And Jesse, I could jump in. I think, you know, we could be here for the rest of the day and several days to talk about all of what we need, but really we need to address structural issues. And they start with the production of affordable housing. We don't have enough affordable housing anywhere in the country. There are proven methods to solve the issue of unsheltered homelessness, like the Housing First initiatives, which are permanent supportive housing with services. But we also need other kinds of housing for those that are not chronic. So we do need a dramatic influx of affordable housing. And there's so many options to do that. You have abandoned buildings everywhere that used to be offices. You have abandoned buildings that people are speculating on. So there's a ton of different ways to address this. Criminalization doesn't solve homelessness, because once people are fined, jailed, or ticketed, they're still homeless at the end of the day. I think another thing that we don't talk about enough is we need a influx of economic development. We need to make sure that people are being paid jobs that have livable wages. We need the Department of Labor to actually start directing programs toward people that are experiencing homelessness. And we need to change the narrative. We need to make sure that people understand that homelessness is not a moral issue. It's not a moral failure by people experiencing homelessness. It's a failure of compassion, of ideas and resources by those that are elected in this country to make this country safe for each and every human being. And we also need to make sure that those groups that are organized, I see that somebody put that in the chat, that are organizing efforts to criminalize homelessness and tell people that the only people are drug addicts and alcoholics, we need to make sure that they find something else to do. Cicero and groups like that. We need everybody to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
On the nose, Donald, if I can, Jesse, I just want to add, we have a massive cultural problem in that you just highlighted. Democrats and Republicans alike have worked really, really hard since the late 1970s to make any measure of welfare or social services a four-letter word. You know, like we can't. We're not going to get out from under an economic problem like homelessness without economic investment. And for some reason, we all think that that's just impossible or impractical. Yeah, it's going to cost money, but it will cost a fraction of what it costs us right now to jail and police homelessness into making it worse. So yeah, we absolutely need to press our elected officials to have the backbone to take us back to foundational principles. These are foundational too. Like when this country was founded, we had a foundational concept that we're supposed to take care of our community members who cannot take care of themselves. Our first battle with modern homelessness during the Great Depression, we invested heavily in creating federal agencies to help address it, and we won that battle. And it wasn't until the late 1970s when it just became politically in vogue to decry individual support systems and housing first models that we lost our ability to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's important to name, right? Like we live in a society, in a system where a human need makes other people money, right? So while that's going on, right, like that is actually the problem that we're facing, is that like human beings have a human need for shelter and for rest, and that human need is turned into something that that people use for investments. They use them like banks, and that dynamic is really at the source of our problem. And within that dynamic, right, homelessness serves as a deterrence. It's the punishment that people receive for not doing enough, not like participating in the system in the way that they're supposed to, right? So I just want to make sure that we're saying, right, like it's like these, like the criminalization of homelessness is also supporting the system of real estate fracking of our urban spaces, right? And that those two things are like completely related. And I feel like also, right, like, so to really tackle like that has to be like our top line. Like, why is it that we live in a society where a human need is like, where someone's desire to make a profit is more important than someone's ability to like live in, to have their human need for housing met, right? So like first thing. And then second, right, like, you know, it's like there have been decades of policy priorities that have put, like we do have two forms of publicly subsidized housing right now. And the biggest are homeownership and prisons, right? Like that our public resources do go towards housing, right? They go predominantly towards housing private individuals in their like asset bubbles that then like that privatizes our social welfare so that people bet more and more on these boxes that they need in order for their future security, and on putting people in cages, right? Like that these are where our that these are where subsidies are going, both in in tax, in tax breaks, and in directly funding the cages where we put people who predominantly are predominantly don't have a place to be, right? And so I think too, right, thinking politically about our public resources and where they belong. It's not that we and I think obviously in order to address either of these things, right, like the state use of public resources to support the real estate investment and the profit making of a tiny elite, right? In order to address those things, right, we need a movement. We need a movement. We need people who are involved in the places where they live, in their apartments, with their communities, who are ready to say that this is not okay. And I think that for me, right, that happens in the tenant movement, because a tenant is just anyone who doesn't control their own housing, right? It's someone who could live outside or who could live in an apartment. And I think part of it for me is understanding that, people who pay rent have so much more in common with people who live outside than they want to admit to themselves. And just I think really pushing back against this revanchist turn into capturing our cities for the sake of a wealthy elite is really the job of all of us, right? It's the job of all of us, not just electeds, not just, it's really on all of us. Yeah, and I'm just Helen, I'm just inspired by you all the time. It's really great to see you.
It's amazing to see you too, sweetie.
I'm going to move us towards some more directed questions. Matt, did anything surprise you during the oral arguments?
Yeah, I would say there were two things that surprised me. Just really quickly, the first one is that there was no real mention of originalism, which is the Supreme Court's prevailing view of the Constitution. Some of the amici briefs went into what the original public meaning of the Constitution, of the Eighth Amendment was, how people in that era would have viewed the laws like the ones Grants Passive enacted, how they would view this criminalization of homelessness. There were briefs that on both sides that tackled this, I thought really interestingly. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops had a really interesting one about vagrancy laws and how the framers would have understood that. None of that was in the oral arguments. I think that was a positive thing, because I think it meant that, as Will said, the court is not interested in revisiting TROP and all the proportionality and precedents that the court has built up during the Warren Court years. And I think Robinson is also part of that. The court has shown an interest in recent years in overturning precedents from the 60s and 70s that doesn't like. So there was always a fear that Robinson could be on the chopping block. For Barrett to expressly disclaim that, I think was a positive sign. The second thing that really stood out to me, and this is sort of more at a more metaphysical level, the court took this very seriously. The court was really thoughtful in how they approached this case. I don't mean to say that they are lazy in any of their other cases, but I have followed cases where they came in very clear on what they were going to do, and the oral arguments were very perfunctory. This was different than that for me. I got the sense that they were actively trying to work through these issues, that they were very concerned about the real world implications of their decisions, that they realized that this is a issue with a lot of moving parts, with a lot of things that, with a lot of potential ramifications on policy, on equity, on human health. So for me, I think it was a heartening sign that the court took this case so thoughtfully and so carefully, even if they ideologically are not inclined to it. I think it opens the door to a lot of potential work down the road, as Will mentioned, that advocates can pursue in this subject.
Thanks, Matt. Will, I'm going to turn it over to you. Will coordinated the Friend of the Court brief effort There were 42 briefs submitted by people who agree with us that throwing folks in jail is not a good solution to homelessness, signed on behalf of 1,100 individuals. I'm curious to hear from you what it was like to coordinate that movement and what it felt like to be in the court that day, watching the oral arguments in person.
Well, it was exhausting, but also super inspiring. We have a kind of fractured, balkanized group of different organizations and agencies around the country that care about this stuff, that care about the plight of the unsheltered homeless population in this country, and we're working hard to do everything we can with very, very few resources at our disposal. Because of those limitations on resources and just the balkanization since we've been defunding housing first programs and other resources for people in need, has made it really, really difficult sometimes for us to come together. But this was not one of those situations. In fact, quite the opposite. All different stakeholders from all different walks of life, all different kinds of nonprofit work, all different kinds of governments. In fact, we flipped several of the original amici who I think were largely responsible for the court taking the case in the first place. A lot of really prominent elected Democrats and Democratic cities that told the court in the beginning, hey, please take this case, flipped to not necessarily filing a brief in support of the respondents, but they flipped to a neither party brief, which means that they supported nobody specifically, and the substance of their brief actually supported our argument. So because of all of that, it was incredibly inspiring. It was one of the biggest amicus efforts that this court has ever seen. I want to say it's definitely in the top 10 cases of all time. Just to give you some context, a total of 108 amicus briefs filed in this case from the 25 at the cert petition phase. Merit phase, there was 33 for the petitioners, 8 neither party, 42 on our side. So we had the lion's share of those, especially when you factor that the 8 neither parties were actually really arguing on our side, kind of like the United States, the Solicitor General's brief, who argued at oral argument as well. But like Donald said, it really is the beginning of an incredible movement that we're hoping to keep this momentum behind so that we can get our policymakers to do the right thing. Because we're not going to solve this in the courts.
Thanks, Will. Tracy, your piece was called New Sundown Towns in reference to the fact that Grants Pass was a sundown town. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact that racism, white supremacy has on how you frame the article and this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think it's really important to name, right? Like it's the new sundown towns that are the old sundown towns, right? Like racism has not disappeared. Perhaps we've like shifted our techniques. And I think that yeah, Josephine County was a sundown town that like there used to be hooded Klan marches down 6th Street. And like people and white supremacy continues to be active in Southern Oregon, right? That like white supremacist groups are still there and present because of that history, right? Like the racial dynamics of the place are maybe different than they are elsewhere, right? But I think that I think like to think about the history of housing policy is also to think about how race was created in the United States, or like what race means today. And those two things are completely connected, right? The kind of structural exclusion from home ownership that has shaped a racial wealth gap, the like abandonment of predominantly Black and brown people to disinvested cities when like suburbs were being speculated, right? And so like, it's like people talk about white flight, but they were actually chasing subsidies, right? They were chasing government subsidies. And so like, I think that like when we talk about the, and of course, right, like all of this history, all of this history is present when we look at something like the predominance of predominance of Black people in our homeless populations, right? And like this is true in every city and across the country. And that like you know, and to me, really that like legacy of like the legacy of property and what it has done in this country, like is there. And I think you know, it has been a really I'm sorry, this is a really good question and I think a lot about it. So obviously I have many thoughts at the same time. But you know, the right wing is doing a really effective job at laundering their racism through the neutral category of the homeless, right? So that this kind of like meting out punishment against poor people and the like extreme surveillance that they use in their media by like and the way that they're like recruiting people via the dehumanization of homeless people, right? Like in so many cases, it's a way to launder their racism. And I think that like you know, that when I was there, like you know, I think like, you know, to talk like basically to wrap up, because I know I've gone on, right? But like to talk about housing in this country is to talk about race. And you really like can't do one without the other. And so I think, yeah, I'll end it there.
Thanks, Tracy. And again, would encourage everyone to read their article. Donald, you have been in this movement for a long time. And I want to hear from you what it was like on April 22nd. Like, can you put that in context of the movement and homelessness and what it felt like to be there that day?
It was powerful, and just for full disclosure, I experienced homelessness myself almost 30 years ago, and I came from a community that we considered a beloved community. That there was always people standing up and being willing to protest. But the last time I saw the national homeless movement kind of involved in that was around 2000, maybe 2002. We had the Kids Day on Capitol Hill, and kids came from all across the country, and they helped to pass the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act. So for me, it was a long time coming. There's been a lot of mini protests, but it really felt like this is what I came to DC to do. I love being able to talk to our elected officials and to be able to go to conferences but the real work is on the ground, helping people understand that they're not alone. Because there's so many issues that we have to address, and we are not powerful enough. If you put every national group together, there's not enough of us to make change. The change has to come from within. It has to come from being able to help empower and equip people with lived experience to be involved and to show them that that's actually happening. It really, really made me feel proud, Jesse. Really made me feel like we were doing what at least I was put here to do. And so I will not forget that moment, and hope that, as Will said, that it wasn't the end. It wasn't one event. It was the start of something bigger, and we can do more and more of this because Frederick Douglass, who's much wiser than me, said, "Power concedes nothing without protest. It never has, and it never will." And that's the only way we get to these issues is if we do something that really makes people know that we're not going to stand for it anymore, whether it's racism. And just to let people know in the chat, because I saw a lot of conversations about this, there's a difference between racism and prejudice. Everybody can be prejudiced, but racism involves power. A person has to be empowered to be able to provide race, to be able to enact racism. And people that are experiencing homelessness don't have power unless they choose to have power. And so that's what we have to do. And we have to stand beside them. And I really felt a part of something bigger that day. I'm sorry, I went on. But there's so much we could talk about. And I'm just glad that this forum is open and that we can have a genuine, open conversation about what's happening in this country.
Thanks, Donald. And let's close with Helen. Helen, last night you shared with me that the police have gotten even worse, have gotten even more extreme in how they interact with people experiencing homelessness. Can you kind of paint a picture about what's happened and what's changed in the past 6 months that this court case has been going on?
Yeah, they were a little bit more understanding before, you know, because they knew that they had to walk a fine line. But they've become more aggressive at giving out their tickets, fining people. You know, before it would be like you'd get a little bit of a chance, or they'd give you a little bit of leeway. There's none now. They're going around, they're pulling up people's, you're not allowed to stake your tent down. And if you do, they're pulling up your stakes, you're getting another ticket. They've made up so many more ordinances since the hearing on the 22nd until now. There's been just unbelievably what the city council has done here. And the ordinances that they're making up are just ridiculous. It's just a way for them to keep fining people who can't pay. You know, I've not heard of anybody gone to jail yet. However, I know that there has been arrest and release that I've heard of. But overall and ultimately, you know, they're not as understanding as they were in the beginning. And now that it's getting closer and closer to, you know, the outcome of the case, they're just rude. They're even more rude than they were before. And they're more heartless.
Thank you, Helen. I know we are at 1 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for joining, all of our panelists in the Republic for putting this together. We are expecting a decision any day now, probably this Thursday, next Friday, anytime between now and the 28th is a possibility. So please sign up for a mailing list, housing.handcuffs.org, visit our website, johnsonvgrantspass.com. We will be hosting a webinar the day after the decision to share with folks what's in the case, what the court did, and how we can move forward from this. So please make sure to follow us at homeless_law on social media for a day of reactions. We are so grateful to be in this fight with all of you, and know we have a tremendous amount of work coming at us when the court does whatever they're going to do, but the court was never going to end homelessness. That is going to take us to push all our elected officials to do, and we're excited to do that with all of you. Stay tuned for a decision, and this recording will be shared via the New Republic's channels as well. So if you have friends that want to listen or miss part of it, it'll be available online. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you,
Jess.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.